Congratulations for looking so glamorous this morning. What time is it there?
It is 6:30 in the morning. Yeah, it's early. It's early. I've got my coffee. Not even actually a Starbucks, just a Starbucks mug with instant coffee because I didn't have time to make proper coffee this morning. But, which I know is sacrilege in your house, Andrea.
Yes, it is. Yes, you can't say that to a Melbourne person. Now, for those of you who don't know Katrina Hutchinson O'Neill, I have flown her out here twice to present at our events. I knew her from my time in London. Her expertise around talent acquisition is second to none, and how you work with business. In the last couple of years, she started an amazing company called I remember when you started it. I remember being over in London in 2019 and talking about it, and to see what you've achieved in the last year, 2 years almost now, has been out of this world.
It's been a little bit busy, Andrea, yeah.
Yeah, just a smidge busy, but you are taking what you've learned from starting an own business and now being a lot more sort of out there building your own business, and how you could actually take what you've learned and bring it into the TA function, which you're calling Intrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit more of a how to do it much better than I did when I was in-house. I think that's probably the gist of what I'm sharing today.
Well, this will be some fabulous learning for our TA folks. So I'm going to turn myself off here and hand over to you. You just need to share your screen if you do have some slides along the bottom.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much. Oh, well, everyone, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm really missing being in Australia. I think that over lockdown, I probably would have at least twice by now over the lockdown period. So I definitely can't wait to get back. And yeah, as Andrea says, I've been on quite the journey myself over the last couple of years. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. It's not necessarily about my story today per se. This is definitely much more about the learnings that I've had coming from the corporate background and moving into the entrepreneurs world. I did have some slides to share with you, but unfortunately, when I've tried to share them, it has told me that I am not allowed to share the slides with you unless I close Google Chrome and start it again, which is absolutely fine. So I'm going to freewheel without some slides. Andrew, if you're good with that, I'm okay with that this morning. So a little bit of background, I guess, to start off with about entrepreneurs and what an entrepreneur is, because it sounds a little bit of a woke title, I guess, but to kind of give you the background, the official kind of line on an entrepreneur is that an entrepreneur is someone who sits inside a company and takes hand-on responsibility for creating innovation of any kind within a business. There's a lovely phrase I've heard of, entrepreneurs are dreamers who do, and I absolutely love that as a phrase, because how many times have we all sat in our jobs and over coffee or with a glass of wine after work, sat and talked to our friends or our colleagues about all the things that we would do. You know, if I was CEO for the day, what would I change? Or if I was the boss, what would I change? Or if only people would listen, what would I change? And I love that idea of an entrepreneur being a change agent who's a dreamer who then does and spurs that into action. There's another really good quote, though, from Rochelle Mead, which I love, which is that throughout history, people with new ideas who think differently and try to change things have always been called troublemakers. And I love that, because that really speaks to me in my experience of my career. And actually, I think that does very often go hand in hand with entrepreneurship and being a change agent inside an organization. And I'm going to touch on that today, because I think that holding those two things, that innovation is difficult and that not everybody will embrace it, is really important, because that will definitely be part of your experience in that entrepreneurial world. So to talk a little bit about, I guess, the context of my background and experience, I probably always felt quite entrepreneurial. I remember when I've had a job since I was 13. My first job was getting paid like $1 an hour in a bakery, and I've always been in work since. But I remember even designing in the 1980s hair scrunchies, which were just appalling, proper 1980s, 1990s hair scrunchies, and selling them in a local shop for like 20 pence. So I think there's always been a bit of a spark there to want to tinker with things, to want to design things and be creative and do things a little bit differently. And when I went into the corporate world and kind of kicked off my career in my very early 20s, I probably felt very quickly that you had to put on a little bit of a mask. You had to conform a little bit to fit in. I hadn't appreciated probably as much as I should have done in my school days that in the corporate world, and I think it has improved to an extent, but certainly then back in the kind of late 90s, early noughties, that you were kind of expected to get in your lane. So you came into a job, that was your role, particularly when you were very young. We certainly didn't have the same attitude back then as we do now in terms of embracing some of the new ideas that younger members of the workforce can come in with. It was very much sit in your corner, shut up, do your job, learn, and maybe at some point you'll earn the right to have an opinion broader than your own role. So that was the world I came into, which was quite challenging as a youngster entering the workforce. But I wasn't good at it either. So I wasn't very shutting up, and I find that I had to put on a bit of a mask when I came into work, trying to do the smiley face and trying to fit in, whilst on the inside feeling anywhere from discontented to actively frustrated at times, because I could see that there were things around me that could be done better, but frustrated that I was, potentially at times working with people who were doing things in a way that even they knew wasn't the great way of doing things, but they just didn't either have the passion to change it, or they were too tired and had potentially been beaten down in terms of their own efforts to change things. So my experience through my early career was very much one of trying to mask, trying to fit in, trying to put that work face on. My first experience, we talked a lot about work me. Like work me was somebody really different to the outside of work me, and a lot of hard work, but I was really lucky, and I fell into a company around about 2002, 2003 that was on active scale up. I joined as I think employee about 100, and by the time I left there were 1,500 of us 5 years later. And it was great because in an organisation that's growing that fast, you have the opportunity to wear many hats and to do lots of things that, frankly, you're not remotely qualified to do. And you get to test and learn and all of that great stuff. So that was a great boost for me. And as I went on in my career, I took a lot of my learnings from that. And that's definitely what helped me to be successful. But don't get me wrong, as I continued to grow my career and went into bigger corporates, I definitely very much felt the back in your box type mentality. So I personally got to a point where about 2018, and Andrea knows because she was on some of this journey with me, I just delivered another massive TA transformation for an organisation. And I sat and had a moment of reflection and looked around me and said, well, look, what I want to do next. I went for an interview at a very, very well-known alcoholic beverages manufacturer, which I thought would be a good fit because they made vodka. I liked vodka. What could possibly go wrong? Went in and had a chat with them. And it was a lovely chat. They were lovely people. But at the end of it, I went and sat in my car in the parking lot and I felt super despondent. And I had to unpick that a bit on my really long drive home. And I had a little bit of a realization that the reason I felt a bit despondent was, although I'd had a great chat and their global TA role sounded great and the money would be good and it looked like the right next move on my CV. When we really talked about what I would actually be doing every day, I could literally plan out in my head the next 2 years of my life. I knew what that roadmap was going to look like. And I felt like I wasn't actually going to be able to change things or to do anything that would be different, that I would really learn from. So that was a bit of an epiphany for me, and hence why I started up my own business. Which, for those of you that have done it, hats off to you. It's blooming hard work. My frequent mantra is, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But that kind of piece of be careful what you wish for. That experience I had of going from the corporate confines and being a frustrated intrapreneur and stepping into the entrepreneurial world, it was such a big difference on many levels. And the smallest of which, actually probably the most impactful, I remember literally about 3 or 4 weeks after setting up my own company, and by then it wasn't really a company, it was just me at that point. But I remember 3 or 4 weeks in, one of our cats had to go to the vet. And I was like, oh, goodness sake, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I'm going to have to get the cat, put it in a box, bring it to the vet. And I was driving to the vet's, and I felt like I was playing hooky from school, because I'd left during the working day and I hadn't told anybody. And then I realized, well, yeah, that's literally me, I'm the boss. And it seems like such a small thing, but that was a big moment for me of making that conscious transition to go, even as a senior executive inside the workplace, I still felt very much like I was working within confines, and that was probably a stifling factor for me for that intrapreneurship, that it hadn't quite nailed that. And having to deprogram myself from that. So since then, you know, some of my other learns, definitely in terms of that entrepreneur piece, I'll share with you today a few of them, but some of them have been very much around coming to grips with things that you've perhaps been told in your past, in your job, that were not positive, actually are really positive attributes when you channel them in the right way and you have the right format. And my big wish is I had only known some of those things, I think, when I was in my career 20 years ago in-house. So, and if you had slides in front of you, this would be much easier to see, but what I had done here is put a little slide together with some of the feedback I've had over my career, and I wonder how many of you will resonate with this. So different words that were used, a little bit like in your school report, when you're working hard to try to be an entrepreneur, to be a change agent inside a company. So ambitious would be one. You get a lot, yeah, you're really ambitious, and actually what people meant by that internally was very often, you're a little bit scary. And I'm not really sure of your motivations. Do you maybe want my job? As opposed to, isn't it great that you're passionate for something and you want to do it differently? Great news is, that's a really good asset as an entrepreneur. So definitely if you're getting that type of feedback, don't stifle it. Another one was, you're very creative, which actually was school report for doesn't follow the rules very well, perhaps a little bit of a dreamer. Persistent was another one. Sometimes persistent stroke resilient, and they were used interchangeably, which often meant little bit pushy, maybe get back in your box and give up if we've said no 3 times, just stop it. High energy was another one, which I think also sometimes could mean a little bit irritating. Just calm yourself, bring yourself down to everybody else's level, just relax. Or my favorite was, you've got a very open risk appetite, which I always kind of took as, she's probably going to get us sued when you were in-house. So those were definitely my experiences as an internal entrepreneur and a change agent inside the organization. It took a lot of resolve, to kind of work through others' perceptions when they chose to perceive your positivity and your efforts and your energy and your desire for positive change as something that in some way, personally or professionally, threatening, or potentially in some cases frustration that was channeled onto you on their part because they didn't perhaps have the same drives, but maybe wished that at times they did, or they saw that you were getting kudos for some of those changes that you eventually got made and they weren't. So that was my experience as an entrepreneur. And I think if I had known when I was in-house what I know now, I would have been a lot less hard on myself, and probably a bit more understanding of the context within which I was working. In terms of entrepreneurship in an institutionalized way, so looking at the wider context, it's great to see that there are definitely some amazing examples of companies who are doing great things to support entrepreneurship inside their companies. Loads of examples out there, but if I pick on a couple, there are companies out there who provide funding and senior management attention to prospective projects. Google would be a great example of this, where they actually have an entrepreneurship fund internally in their company. It's something that's recognized and rewarded in your management reviews and your 360 reviews, which is fantastic. Cargill would be another great example where they establish and run a full service group with a mandate for corporate entrepreneurship. They call it corporate entrepreneurship rather than entrepreneurship. But they sponsor that as a big part of their strategy as an organization. Some other companies are a little bit more opportunist around their approach. So Zimmer would be a great example of this. So Zimmer have no deliberate approach to entrepreneurship. I think that's probably been more my experience over my career working in-house, is that there hasn't been necessarily that deliberate approach. They don't discourage it. They definitely want to have it. However, they want it to be something that is very organic within the organization. So with Zimmer, that's definitely their approach. So they have internal and external networks to drive concept selection and resource allocation, but it's very much self-managing. And then another example would be DuPont, who they've got a great advocacy approach where they evangelize entrepreneurship, but they leave it to local business areas and local departments to drive that collectively forward, but allow them to also provide funding for that as well. So I call those out as 4 different examples, that kind of enabler, an active producer, an opportunist, or an advocate. I think sadly though there are still many examples of organizations where it's just not there, and I also see and I have worked in some organizations where innovation and entrepreneurship is a function within the organization, which blows my mind that that's the case, where there's a group of people who have got a special label and they sit in a special office and their job is innovation or entrepreneurship. So they have a particular reserve on it because they're special, and it doesn't necessarily sit with the rest of the organization, perhaps outside of your suggestions box in the canteen. And I think if that's the type of an organization you're working in, and you really do feel like a passionate entrepreneur and an internal innovator, maybe then it's possibly the time to think about whether your desires and your capabilities are going to be best met inside that organization if they very much box in innovation and entrepreneurship. So how to start? If you're feeling like you're sitting in HR or talent or somewhere else in your company and you're feeling like you have this entrepreneurial drive, perhaps you've even got experience in delivering it, like how do you start? How do you get going? And honestly, my biggest advice is literally just put your hand up. you might find yourself in good company. Start talking about your ideas. Start talking about, in a very positive way, the opportunities for improvement that you see around you. Even better, get stuck in. Start putting forward some of your ideas into practice, and look at how you can make some small incremental wins in a way that, even if it's at the beginning, is not threatening politically to those around you, but gets the positive attention and engagement that you need strategically for some of your bigger ideas. I think those are great ways to start. And when you look at that in-house talent entrepreneurship, there are loads of examples of people who have done that. And it doesn't always have to be the big, grandiose idea, although those are fantastic as case studies. If you look a little bit more broadly and outside of talent, and some of the examples of entrepreneurship that are spoken about most often, some of those examples are things like Sony PlayStation. I don't know how many of you know this, but Sony PlayStation actually came about through entrepreneurship, where a guy called Ken Kategori was kind of fed up with his daughter's Nintendo console, fiddled with it, came up with a better idea for a games console, tried to sell this concept into his bosses in Sony, who kind of met the idea with disdain because they thought that the gaming industry was a bit of a flash in the pan, and they didn't think it's where Sony as a serious music business needed to go to. But Ken persevered, and eventually one person in the organization at a senior level realized the merit of the idea, and that's where Sony as a gaming company was born. So that's a small idea on his part that became a huge corporation changing idea for the company that he worked in. On a smaller level, Facebook's like button, how many of us use that every single day, which has now been carried across to things like LinkedIn and other social media. That came about through a structured approach that Facebook had to innovation, one of the threads of which is their internal all-night hackathons, where employees come together and literally design things overnight. And the like button was born from one of those events, and is now something that we probably couldn't live without. Although I still really want a head in my hands emoji as my like button, particularly on LinkedIn. But yeah, I've given that feedback and they've not taken it on board yet. And then another example would be Post-it notes. I think it's probably the best known example. In 3M, a scientist many years ago invented a adhesive that was sticky but not too sticky and not too solid. Nobody knew what to do with it. It sat there for years until another employee called Art Fry had the idea that he needed a bookmark that didn't stick to the pages of his book. And through that's where that bit of entrepreneurship, solving a small problem that he had, then became the biggest thing that company went on to sell. Other examples are things like the Happy Meal, the strike strip on the side of a box of matches, Amazon Prime, all different examples of entrepreneurship that have become really successful. But if we bring this back to the HR and talent world, there are some stunning examples of people who have done great things by just thinking about their world a bit differently. One example I'd call out that's probably on the bigger, grander idea scale, but I still think a great example is a lady called Melanie Hayes in the UK, who many of you know. I know that Andrea, you know Melanie well. And Melanie was the head of TA for a large organisation in the UK that had a really big dependency on agency temps. And she looked at two problems. One problem that she was struggling with was the one that we've all struggled with 100 times, which is getting the correct budget that we need to support growth and innovation and delivery for in-house TA. And the second one was that she didn't feel like she was consistently getting the service that she needed from all of her vendors, and she thought she could probably do a better job. And Melanie managed over the space of a couple of years, initially by stealth, and then eventually as she got more and more case study to support it much more openly in the organisation, to create her own temp agency within her organisation, and effectively not only became her own supplier, but was so successful that she started then being a supplier for other organizations. So she effectively transformed a big chunk of her cost center as an in-house TA leader into another revenue center for her organization, which is phenomenal. And I really do think probably one of the best examples of in-house talent entrepreneurship that I've seen. Another example, it would be those TA leaders, and there's a few examples of this, who have made talent almost like an organizational cryptocurrency that they own the dashboard and the stock exchange for. So that concept of trying to elevate the perception of talent and talent acquisition to a more senior stage within the organization by pushing forward the commercial and the strategic benefits that the organization is getting from how they acquire talent, including how they're utilizing for hard to fill roles, things like apprentices, early career schemes, etc. But also the advantages that they're getting commercially and practically in the organization from the way in which they migrate and mobilize talent, and elevating that conversation to the point that people see the value of that as something apart from everything else that traditionally was done within HR. So moving that needle away from that ridiculous old-fashioned idea that some companies still have of the HR personnel function, no matter how modern it is, but moving it towards that truly strategic driver piece. I think anyone that achieves that within an organization is absolutely living the entrepreneurship vibe. And another example would be turning models or perceptions on their heads for strategic advantage for your organization. So that, I think examples of that can be seen in how HR and talent leaders have approached things like employer branding, and even where employer branding actually becomes at times more effective than the actual brand of the business. And I'm going to use a weird example on this one, only because it's quite close to my heart, because they were literally one of my first clients when I started up my own business, which was the British Army. And the British Army really had a challenge with recruiting. They weren't meeting their numbers. They needed to hire about 5,000 regular soldiers a year, and they were hitting about 60% of that in a good year. And it was becoming an issue for national debate. I think you're in a bit of trouble as a TA or a talent leader whenever what you're doing is being discussed by the Prime Minister on TV. That's probably the point at which you might be filling in your kind of end of year appraisal form with I'm going to give myself a 3 out of 5 this year, I'm not sure. So they were really struggling with that. And a lady called Kath, who headed up the recruitment for the Army through Capita, along with her team, worked really hard on the operational side in terms of how do we do the operational transformation and get this working better, which is where I came in. The bit that I had nothing to do with that I really wanted to call out as entrepreneurship in this context, though, is what they did with employer brand. And they had a really edgy approach to employer brand for the British Army, and tried to make, through their employer branding, the British Army relevant to the millennial generation. And anyone that wants to Google it, you can Google they called it the Snowflake campaign. So taking negative stereotypes of millennials and turning them into positives in terms of why the Army would want people like that. What was great about what they did with that, though, from an entrepreneurial perspective, wasn't just that it solved the problem that they specifically had, which was, how do we talk to a different audience that we've not traditionally talked to very well? What it also did was it really changed the narrative nationally about the army and what the army was like as a company, effectively, to work for, and not just what careers in the army were like, but what would your experience be of engaging with this structure as a part of the British conversation, the British public. And I thought that was phenomenal, and really changed the narrative in the press even about the modern army. So I called those out as some examples of where, you know, people trying to solve what might have seemed like small problems for them, very locally to talented HR, but approaching it in quite an entrepreneurial fashion and removing some of the barriers to their thinking had truly, truly transformational impacts in their organizations. So a couple of bits then in terms of, so what stops you? What can stop people living in that entrepreneurial space? And my experience is definitely probably three things. There are three traps that it's really easy to fall into. Number one is what I call the familiarity trap. So that familiarity trap is that, and it's endemic in human nature, favoring the familiar over the unfamiliar. So if I use the example of the British Army, you know, if those guys had been thinking about it using familiarity thinking, they would have just tried to do something a little bit incrementally better than what they'd done before, because it was familiar and it was understood, and it was not going to cause controversy internally or externally. So that's a bit more comfortable. You're probably less likely to get some of the adjectives that I talked about earlier thrown back at you in a bit of a double-edged sword way. Second one would be the maturity trap, and this is again pretty common. So favoring the mature over the nascent. So looking at something and saying, well, look, you know, we've got a model that's kind of always been done that way. So if you look at Melanie Hayes as the example there with her in-house agency model, you know, we've got an agency model, we've got an MSP for our team. It's always worked that way. Let's just optimize that. Let's just improve it a little bit because it's a mature model. It's understood. Procurement get it, legal get it, finance gets it, or end users get it, and it's proper, and there's an industry that sits around it. So we'll stick with what we've got. Again, all completely understandable and completely human ways of thinking. But pulling yourself away from that and going, well, just because it's been there for a long time doesn't make it mean it's great. Like, I'm pretty sure they used children to sweep chimneys for 100 years or more. That was a pretty mature industry. Probably didn't mean it was the best way to do things. So really trying to pull yourself out of that comfort zone of just because it's established doesn't mean it's necessarily the best approach. And then the final one for me, I think, is the proximity trap. So that idea of favoring proximity to existing solutions rather than completely new solutions. So a little bit similar to the maturity trap, but one step different in that incrementally changing something. So I've got a new idea, but it's a minor build on what we've already got here, versus I've got a new idea and it's completely different to what we've done before. So I think a good example of that would be, I wish I could show you a picture of it if I could screen share, but there was a device that was designed in the 1980s, 1990s, which was a cradle that you could put on your shoulder so that when you were talking on your wired phone that was connected to your wall in your kitchen and trying to cook something or do something, you could literally put your handset from the wall onto this and hold it on your neck. So that was an incremental, that was a proximity improvement compared to the concept of a wireless phone, or even better headsets, or even better wireless headphones. And it's an easy trap to fall into because, again, logical human nature to think about things incrementally, versus the concept of, well, what if we rub that out and start it again? And that's where companies that are famous for innovation have really won. Companies like Apple, who have said, well, look, let's throw all of that away and start from the beginning and design something that carries out what we need it to carry out, but in a completely different way. So those are the three traps that I think it's really easy to fall into as an entrepreneur, and constantly testing yourself on, if I'm thinking about a solution, am I thinking about it under the guises of familiarity or maturity or proximity? And if I'm not, if the solution I'm coming up with still stands up, even if I've challenged myself on those three fronts, then hey, you've probably got a great idea on your hands. So I guess just to wrap up, I wanted to leave you with kind of seven, what I've called the sinful seven rules for covert entrepreneurs, or particularly anybody here who's thinking of starting out as an entrepreneur, and you've maybe not done it before, or you've maybe done it before and got beaten down a little bit, and you want to give it another go, but you want to do it in a safe way. These seven rules are actually rules that apply as an entrepreneur as well as an intrapreneur in my experience, and they're definitely things that I adhere to today as we're building and growing our company. So my seven rules are number one, try to work underground as long as you can. That sounds a little bit counterproductive in terms of thinking, but the reason I say work underground as long as you can is that publicity tends to trigger inside a company the corporate immune system. So whenever people start to hear about something you're doing and something you're changing, there will always be naysayers. And that's great. They're going to come anyway, but actually you want them to come along at the time that you're ready to have the conversation with them. You don't want them to strangle the idea before it's even really come to fruition. So the same, as I said, works externally as an entrepreneur. You don't want to launch your great idea, your great innovation, or your great strategy in your area into the world in front of your competitors until you're ready to pull the trigger on it, because you're giving away your strategic advantage. So I think that's a really important first step. Second one is that old adage, it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. That requires some brave pills at times, and it definitely requires you to have an intelligent read on the organization within which you're working and how much collateral and capacity you've got in the bank with them in terms of being able to push things a little bit further. But generally speaking, the concept of people who stand to wait to get permission are never really going to push anything forward is pretty true. Third one is quite a biggie, which is follow your intuition about the people you choose to work with and try to only work with the best. People who are not the right people to work with. They might be amazing people. I've definitely got people that I've worked with in the past who I love hanging out with outside of work, and we're really good friends and we can have a great time together, but they're not necessarily the right people for me to pull around me in a work context because they don't think in the way that I would need them to think for a particular setup or a particular project. So really be quite harsh with yourself around the people that you're surrounding yourself with and who you're putting on your team effectively, whether that's a formal or informal team when you're trying to drive innovation. The fourth one is find those sponsors who are going to be able to help you and think about your strategies to engage them. Look for whether it's in your peer group. It might actually be people who are more junior than you in the company as well. But who are those key influencers, senior peer group or people who are further down the organization, who can really help with either opening doors, providing access to information, providing access to funding, providing access to the platform that you're going to need whenever it comes time to engage more people in what you've decided to build or to design. Fifth one is linked to that. Honor your sponsors. So where you find sponsors in the organization at any level, make them part of your story. Reward that sponsorship and keep them really engaged with what you're doing, because they will be the biggest asset to anything that you're trying to deliver. Sixth one is be true to your goals, but be realistic about the ways to achieve them. Having the grand plan is fantastic. Having a North Star is absolutely amazing. But there's also got to be a bit of a step of realism along the way. Anybody who knows my co-founder, Kevin, and I, we actually did a really daft video back in January, taking the mickey out of ourselves a little bit on this. Anyone that knows the two of us will know that Kevin is the guy who will have we'll share the grand goal, but Kevin's idea will always be let's just go do it. Let's just jump over that hill. Let's just, bound across that river. Whereas my job is always in that relationship to be a little bit more of okay, I get it. That's what we want to get to, and that's what we want to achieve. But actually, let's figure out like the 16 steps that we're going to have to take to get there without dying on the way. And I think that's really important. But it's important that you have both. It's important to have that energy and that North Star, but that realism about how you're going to get there as quickly as you need to, but with the steps that mean that you're not likely to fall over on the way. And then my final tip is, and this is a tough one, come to work every day like you're willing to be fired. That's a bit scary, particularly in today's climate. But having a fear, like an inbuilt fear of what you could lose, is the biggest killer in my experience of innovation and creativity. And, to make this kind of personal back with me, if I look at my new career over the last couple of years, running a business and scaling a business, it's terrifying. At first it's terrifying because you're by yourself and you've got to build your team around you, and you've got to convince clients to work with you when you've just set up on your own, etc. But it's actually the bigger that your company gets. Like our company now, we've got nearly 60 people working in the company, which I still think is insane, that we're growing so fast, but amazing. But the bigger you get, the scarier that can get as well, because everything gets bigger. And if you have a fear of loss, if you're scared that you might lose something and that losing that would be so crushing to you that it stifles you and it stops you from taking the appropriate risks and from pushing on the right things, you're not going to be successful. And I think the same goes for intrapreneurs or entrepreneurs. You've got to have an acceptable risk tolerance. You've got to be able to work within a context of, if you really want to deliver that change, you've got to work within that context of, okay, there's a risk for this. I'm willing to accept it because I believe so much in the bigger goal that I'm trying to achieve. And I hope the worst doesn't happen, but I'm good with it because I've made my peace with that balance of risk. So come to work every day willing to be fired, or if you want to say it another way, come to work or show up every day with that concept of, if I try and I don't succeed, then at least I've tried and that's okay. Then that's probably the best advice I can give. So thank you. I do appreciate we've probably run a little bit over. So thank you very, very much for that. And I'm just looking at the comments. Andrew, I don't know if because I was having to look at presentations, I couldn't see the comments. If there's any questions that anybody have that I've not.
No, we're not. But shall I say?
So Katrina, hang on a sec. My team are talking to each other in the background here. Katrina,
you socialise in the office, Andrea?
Yeah, well, we're just trying to sort something out for tomorrow. Angela Clark-Chavois asked, so you were sitting right at the beginning, you were sitting in that car park and you thought, I need to do something different and I need to start my own business. Do you wish you'd done it earlier, or do you think you needed all that experience.
Oh, hell no, absolutely not, Andrea. I think by accident, not by design. I'm not gonna, if I ever write a book going, here's my very short story, which will be about 3 pages and not very interesting. I will not claim any credit for the idea of being some kind of architect of the, and I had a plan that said that at the age of 40, I was going to leave behind my internal, very comfortable and well-paid, thank you very much, executive job, and go off and take no income for a year or two. So that was not the plan. But I could not have done it any younger. The age at which I got to and the experience I had literally is how I feel I have been successful in what I've done for the last couple of years. It was literally all of my experience, the resilience, the tenacity, but the knowledge, right? When I was in my 20s or even my early 30s, even the knowledge, because I hadn't worked at a senior enough level at that age in companies. How do you run finance? How do you build strategy? How do you do a board deck? How do you, et cetera, et cetera? I'd have literally had to hire another team of people to fill the gaps in my knowledge if I tried to do this earlier. So for me, definitely, it was it was the right time to do it. But I also think it was the right time, and I probably had like a 5 to 6 year window, I reckon, because if I'd taken that other job and I'd stayed in house for another 5 or 6 years, would have then ever had the motivation to go and do it? I'm not sure.